They said the dead could not harm the living, but one corpse would prove them wrong. It was a king's body, wrapped in silk, entombed in gold, sealed in the heart of his empire. And yet, when that tomb was opened centuries later, what escaped wasn't treasure. It was death itself. The year was 1087. The man was William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England. And what happened to his corpse after death would not only scandalize the medieval world, but, according to many chroniclers, unleash a wave of sickness and superstition so terrible that it would haunt Europe for generations. This is the story of how a king's body rotted, exploded, and, as legend has it, started a plague. William's life had been a masterpiece of brutality. Born a bastard in Normandy, he rose from illegitimacy to conquer England by force. At Hastings, he slaughtered his enemies. In England, he ruled with an iron fist. He burned villages, mutilated rebels, and filled monasteries with gold stripped from the poor. By the time he reached 60, William was the most feared man in Christendom, a mountain of a king whose very name meant destruction. But in the end, it wasn't a sword or arrow that killed him. It was his own gluttony. In the summer of 1087, William rode out to war against the French king. He was massive now, swollen from years of overindulgence, his armor straining against his belly. While plundering the French town of Mantes, his horse stumbled over burning rubble, throwing him forward onto the pommel of his saddle. The iron spike punctured his abdomen, and the wound festered. For 6 agonizing weeks, the conqueror of England lay dying, his body filling with gas and corruption. Monks reported that his chamber reeked so horribly that even his own sons refused to visit. When he finally died, his servants stripped the corpse of its royal robes and fled with the treasures, leaving their king naked on the floor. It should have been the end of the story. But in death, William would achieve something he never managed in life: the unification of disgust, fear, and divine punishment. The treatment of his corpse would become one of the most infamous funerary disasters in medieval history, and, some say, the source of a deadly plague. When William's courtiers finally returned, they found his body bloated, blackened, and oozing. The heat of late summer had accelerated the rot. They wrapped him in linen soaked in herbs, but it did nothing to contain the stench. His son Henry refused to fund the burial, so monks at Can Abbey had to plead for donations just to transport their dead king home. The body was placed on a crude cart and dragged across Normandy under the punishing sun. By the time they reached Caen, the stench was unbearable. Townspeople fled the streets, gagging as the royal procession passed. Horses panicked. One chronicler wrote that birds dropped from the sky as the air thickened with decay. When they arrived at the Abbey of Saint Etienne, the monks wept, not out of sorrow, but because the church itself was filled with the putrid vapor of death. Then came the final humiliation. The monks attempted to lower the enormous corpse into a stone sarcophagus that had been built decades earlier, when William was a younger man, slender, fit, almost unrecognizable from the swollen giant he had become. The tomb was too small. As they struggled to fit him inside, the unthinkable happened. According to multiple medieval chroniclers, when the attendants forced the body into the coffin, William's bloated abdomen ruptured with an explosive sound, spraying putrefied blood and pus across the church. The smell, they wrote, was so overpowering that many fainted. Others ran screaming from the building. The bishop who conducted the ceremony nearly vomited into the open casket. The funeral had to be paused while servants cleaned the floor. What followed became legend. Within days, several monks fell ill, developing fever and sores. A pestilence spread through Caen that winter, killing dozens. To the medieval mind, there could be no coincidence, only divine retribution. The corpse of the conqueror had poisoned the air, and the hand of God was punishing them all. In modern terms, what happened wasn't divine, it was biological. William's decomposing body was filled with bacteria, methane, and sulfur compounds. When it ruptured, the gas pressure expelled droplets of infected material into the air. In an enclosed church packed with people, that miasma could have carried bacteria and disease. Medieval Europe believed sickness came from bad air, and for once, they weren't entirely wrong. The stench of William's death became a metaphor for his reign. Chroniclers compared his rotting body to his corrupt soul. As he ruled the living with fire, one monk wrote, "So did his body burn the air in death." But the horror didn't stop there. Within a year, fires broke out across Normandy. Crops failed. Cattle died mysteriously. Epidemics swept through coastal towns. People whispered that William's unburied soul was haunting the land. Pilgrims claimed to see ghostly processions at night, bloated figures walking barefoot, carrying torches that emitted no light. Priests began conducting nightly vigils to ward off the curse of the conqueror. The idea that a king's corpse could poison the world became part of medieval lore, echoing in sermons, chronicles, and superstitions for centuries. But there's more to this story than just William's death. His was not the only corpse accused of spreading plague. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between faith and fear was paper-thin. The dead were powerful. Their remains could heal or destroy. Churches prized relics of saints because they were believed to bring miracles. But the body of a sinner could bring ruin. Theologians wrote of miasma mortis, the corruption of sin that seeped from a wicked corpse and infected the air. And kings, who claimed divine authority, were especially dangerous when they fell from grace. In William's case, the symbolism was perfect. He had conquered England in blood, stolen from the church, and died without confession. His last words, according to some accounts, were not of repentance, but calculation, dividing his empire among his sons. To a world obsessed with divine justice, it was obvious. God had punished him by turning his body into a plague. But the story didn't end with William's death. 2 centuries later, history would repeat itself. In 1199, another king, Richard the Lionheart, died from a festering wound during a siege in France. His body, like William's, was divided. Entrails buried near the battlefield, heart in Rouen, body in Fontevraud Abbey. The monks who handled his remains fell ill shortly afterward. Chroniclers described it as a fever from the royal flesh. By then, the legend of William's corpse had become so well known that the connection was automatic. Another cursed king, another wave of sickness. These stories reveal something about how medieval people understood disease. They didn't know about bacteria, but they understood corruption. A corpse was more than a body, it was a moral warning. The decay of flesh mirrored the decay of power, the rot of empire, the sin of kings. To handle a wicked corpse was to risk contamination of both body and soul. When we look back at William's funeral, it's easy to see only the grotesque details, the explosion, the smell, the panic. But to the people of his time, it was a cosmic event. In their eyes, the world was a moral ecosystem. A righteous ruler brought harmony. A sinful one brought pestilence. When William's body burst in a sacred place, it wasn't just decay, it was revelation. God was showing them that even the mightiest could become poison. And perhaps, on some level, they were right. Recent archaeological studies have uncovered evidence of localized outbreaks in Normandy in the years following William's burial. Likely smallpox, dysentery, or anthrax spread through contaminated water and livestock. The Abbey of Caen, where William was entombed, sat atop marshy ground that often flooded. Combined with decomposing organic matter from the burial, it could have created the perfect breeding ground for disease. The legend of the king who started a plague may have been rooted in a grim medical reality. Still, medieval chroniclers went further. They claimed the earth itself rejected him. Some said the ground cracked after the burial, as if unable to contain the corruption. Others wrote that strange lights were seen hovering above the tomb, and that the air around it remained foul for years. Pilgrims visiting the abbey were said to faint from the odor, even decades later. Was it truth or embellishment? Perhaps both. Medieval history was rarely clean. Facts and faith were inseparable, each feeding the other like rot spreading through cloth. 200 years after William's death, the abbey was damaged during religious wars. Monks opened the royal tomb to protect its treasures. When they lifted the lid, they found only blackened bones and a foul-smelling liquid pooled at the bottom. The relics were resealed, but soon after, plague swept through Caen again. Once more, the legend revived. The conqueror's curse had awakened. Then came 1522. The French wars of religion reached the abbey, and soldiers looted the tomb. The bones were scattered. Within months, disease erupted in the region. Chroniclers recorded it simply. When the king's bones were touched, death followed. To the faithful, it was proof that even centuries after death, William's body was a vessel of divine wrath. Even in death, his story followed the logic of empire. William's conquest had reshaped Europe. His corpse, they believed, reshaped destiny. To open his tomb was to unleash chaos. By the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, preachers were invoking his name again, claiming that the sins of rulers had cursed the world. The dead King of England had become a symbol, a reminder that no power, no crown, could escape decay. But the real horror of this tale isn't supernatural. It's biological, psychological, and deeply human. The death of William the Conqueror exposes the medieval obsession with control, the desperate need to believe that disease, decay, and death have meaning. When the body of a king exploded, it wasn't just flesh bursting. It was the illusion of divine perfection shattering in front of everyone. Modern medicine can explain the event in detail. After death, the body's internal bacteria multiply rapidly, producing gases that inflate the torso. In heat, decomposition accelerates. Without embalming or refrigeration, the buildup of methane and hydrogen sulfide becomes explosive. When pressure exceeds the limits of the skin, it ruptures, especially if handled roughly. In William's case, the compression of the coffin likely forced the gases to burst outward violently. But in the medieval imagination, this wasn't chemistry, it was revelation. The king's body became prophecy made flesh, corruption revealed through horror. And in a world where the line between moral and physical decay was blurred, such an event could change everything. The explosion of William's corpse didn't just release gas, it released fear, rumor, and meaning that spread like contagion across generations. When plague struck Europe centuries later, people remembered his story. Preachers warned that unrepentant rulers had poisoned the world. Chroniclers wrote that the sins of kings seeped into the ground and turned the air foul. And when the Black Death arrived, it found a civilization already primed to see disease as divine punishment. In that way, William's corpse didn't start a literal plague. It helped create a mental one, a contagion of fear that infected the mind as surely as any germ infected the body. Because that's the real secret of this story. The plague that began with William the Conqueror wasn't just biological, it was psychological. His death taught Europe to fear death itself. Every whisper of rot became a sermon. Every foul smell became a warning. The belief that decay carried sin shaped medicine, religion, and burial rituals for centuries. Mourners wore herbs not just to block the stench, but to ward off evil. Monks burned incense in crypts not for the soul of the dead, but for the health of the living. Entire cities banned funerals inside churches out of fear that corpses could sicken the faithful. One man's bursting corpse had rewritten the relationship between life and death. The irony is that William built his empire on control of land, of people, of history itself. He measured his subjects like property, taxing their every breath. But in death, he lost all control. His final act was chaos. His legacy carried not by monuments, but by microbes. The conqueror became the conquered, undone by his own flesh. In the centuries that followed, his name would be invoked during every epidemic. Plague doctors spoke of the curse of kings. Artists painted allegories of crowned skeletons spreading disease. And in Cannes, pilgrims still left offerings at the site of his tomb, not for blessings, but for protection from infection. Even today, scientists have examined the soil beneath the abbey and found elevated traces of arsenic and lead, perhaps from centuries of embalming and reinterment. The air, once thick with incense and rot, now hums with silence. But the story still lingers, retold by historians and storytellers alike. The day a king's corpse burst open and turned faith into fear. Maybe the real contagion wasn't the sickness at all. Maybe it was the realization that death spares no one, not even those who claim to rule by divine right. 1,000 years later, we still whisper about William's rotting body, not because of its smell, but because of what it meant. That beneath the crown, beneath the legend, every empire, every king is mortal. The world that once worshipped his power now remembers him for the moment he lost it. Not at Hastings, not in battle, but in the silent explosion of his own decay. And as the priests fled the abbey, clutching incense and prayers, the truth lingered in the air like a sickness that would never die. Even kings rot. And sometimes, their rot becomes the world's disease.